Hi, everybody. We are up to chapter three, which discusses culture and media. Okay, so that's what we'll be talking about today. And our first slide kind of discusses some of the paradox or conflict, I don't know what exactly you would call it, between sort of media and culture. And does media influence our culture or is it influenced by our culture? Most sociologists would argue that it's more reflexive, that it plays off each other. Um, it simultaneously reflects and creates the world that we live in. That's what media does. So that comes more at the end of the unit. So we'll talk more about that at the end of the lecture. So let's talk about what is culture. So culture is really very broad. It's extremely broad. It's the way of life. It's our way of life. It's the languages that we speak, our customs, what we create, what we build, both materially and non-materially. And so we'll get into some of the components of culture in a bit. But really, culture is everything that humans create apart from what is natural. Okay, so everything that is not natural, okay, is sort of part of culture. Think about the word agriculture, right? So in agriculture, which appeared on Earth about 4,000 years ago, people began saving seeds, and they saved seeds, they planted seeds, but of course they first had to rip up the soil that was there. So they had to plow the soil, the fields, tear up the earth and the existing flora that was there to plant rice, to plant wheat, to plant corn. And so that's where the word agriculture comes from. It's a culture that humans created that's separate from the natural environment. And we can think of culture as everything that's sort of human created. Okay? So the concept of culture, though, has evolved and it's expanded throughout our history. Culture was first studied by anthropologists. And a lot of the tools and the research methods that sociologists use to study culture came from cultural anthropology, but it's become a very important part of sociology. We tend to think of culture, and some of the early anthropologists thought of culture as something that was exotic or something that was uh, high class, right? Like like opera music, artwork. But culture is much more broad than that. It's our entire way of life, okay, that is apart from the natural environment. Europeans came into contact, of course, with people in the Americas beginning in the 14th and 15th centuries, and they experienced what they would call what we would call today a culture shock. Or the cultures in the Americas were very, very different than the cultures in Europe, and the Europeans, by and large, of course, tended to look down upon non-European culture. They called the American Indians that lived in the eastern shore of what is now the United States savages, right? That had to be converted to Christianity or had to be just eliminated. And so culture and the analysis of culture comes with hierarchies, and you can't separate it also from power. The first cultural anthropologists that studied non-Western cultures beginning in the 19th century were actually employed by like for example, the British government. And they were employed by the British government to try to understand the factors in that culture so that they could better be controlled by the empire. Now, anthropology and cultural anthropology, and then, of course, sociology is much different than that today. In fact, anthropologists and sociologists, more often than not, will try to, kind of challenge pre-existing power relations and critique power relations. Okay. So let's get to a couple other terms here. There are various components of material. There are various components of culture, including material and non-material culture. Okay? These are separate but also related. Material culture is anything that is, an object, something that is physical. So anything from an automobile to a computer to a um, tool or a chair, right? So anything that's material in nature. Non material culture are ideas, are ideologies. Okay, so examples of non material culture would be like the language, okay, like the English language, the Spanish language. Religion is part of material culture. I'm sorry, non material culture. Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, it's all part of non material culture because this is something that, it's an idea, it's a philosophy. Um, Sometimes, of course, material and non-material culture are very, very much related. So the book talks about this, but I'll just give you one or two examples here. So obviously, um, in the United States, the microchip was invented in the 1960s, and that was an object, right? But then that object also it also changed the language. We now have the term microchip. So, material object obviously can impact non material culture. The same with, say, binge watching, right? So, binge watching, it was a new word that was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2018. And binge watching, as you probably know, comes from this new technology of streaming, right? We have all these streaming services now, like Netflix and Prime, and they usually, sometimes not always, but they usually have all of the episodes, right, in line. You can just watch one after the other after the other. It's very different from when you watched TV that was broadcasted and you had to wait a week or even longer between shows. And then obviously you had to wait for the new season to come out a year later. Okay, so that's just a couple examples of how um, things that are created, of course, as a physical object can also change the non material culture, especially language, words, and ideas. Let's talk a little bit about what this term of cultural lag is. So, I see cultural lag a little bit differently than how it's presented here in the notes. A cultural lag really is one aspect of culture changes faster than the culture itself or than another aspect. And because of this, no new social norms have really been developed around that thing that has changed so quickly. Okay, so it goes beyond technology, but technology and new technology often contributes to it, but it's actually broader than that. It's more than that. We can think about just the creation of cell phones, right? And cell phones, and let's talk more about smartphones, which came out in like 2006 or 2007, the iPhone, and then the Droids came out. And that really changed a lot of things, did it not? Right? It changed kind of texting and driving, and it changed work culture when your employer could reach you at any time. Should you respond to an email at 10 o'clock at night? Maybe so, maybe not. Does the employer have the right to do that, to contact you outside of work hours? So with internet, with cell phones, with expanded use of technology and data, there's been so many changes, and our social norms and expectations can't really keep up. The same with cell phone use in classes, in school. A lot of teachers K through 12 are now trying to incorporate technology and tablets or phones into the actual instruction. Same with colleges, especially larger universities where there's 300 people in a classroom. So there's all these things that change so fast, and the culture really can't keep up. Um, there are many other examples of that. Even examples like we still use an agrarian school calendar, right? Even though the majority of Americans haven't farmed since the 1910s or so, or more than 100 years ago. So even though about only 2% of the American population are farmers, we still have this agrarian calendar that's based on the growing season, right? So school would start in the fall after the harvest, and it would end in the spring before planting season, right? And that's how, when public schools were first formed, that's the reason why they had that schedule. And this is just stuck, and colleges um, adopted it as well. And does it really make sense for the kind of culture that we're living in today to have like this summer break, right? And that's those are things that might be changed, of course, in the future. Obviously, people need breaks, but maybe we would have 3 breaks throughout the year rather than a long break in the summer. Okay, that's just an idea. Here's another term that probably most of you haven't seen or heard of before. This term is called cultural relativism. And cultural relativism was coined by Ruth Benedict in the 1930s. And it's the idea that we ought not to judge another person's culture by our own, that we should not use our own standards to judge another person's culture, or another society, or another culture, but we should try to understand that culture from its own history and perspective, and by their own standards, not by our standards. Okay, this is kind of a harder thing to grasp. We'll talk more about this in the next slide, when we look at culture shock here. So we're increasingly, obviously, living in a globalized world. We obviously have seen this with coronavirus, that diseases can spread, that viruses do not know national boundaries, and we've been living in a globalized world more and more, for a long time, but increasingly since the 1990s, especially when trade picked up between China, South Korea, and the United States, and the European Union and the U.S. Obviously, it goes back further than that, but over the last 20, 30 years, trade especially has become a much bigger aspect of our economy, and so has international travel. So a culture shock is something that you experience when you can't really read the meanings, or you feel a little bit disoriented when you're in a new or unfamiliar culture. And it doesn't have to necessarily be international. It can be even within our own society. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. But let me just give you a couple examples. So when I was in Italy a few years ago, the first time I was in Italy, you have to pay to use the restrooms, and that was kind of a culture shock to me, right? And it's something I got used to, but I was kind of glad to get back, where we had free restrooms in the United States. Same in a lot of parts of Europe, you might have to pay for water. They don't have free drinking fountains where you can get water for free. And sometimes the bottled water is more expensive than alcohol. Sometimes in Spain it's that way. In Italy it can be that way. Or the prices are much more on par. A bottle of water may cost $3, or 3 euros, and wine may cost €3. So it's those are new things that are different to us. Um, Another example would be in Germany, where it's not common to have small talk. Small talk is a very American thing, right? Where um, instead of you just talk about weather, talk about sports, something that is just passing the time. Um, Small talk is less common in Germany, less common in England, less common in parts of Europe, more so in Northern Europe. Um, Dinner conversation is not that common in Germany, for example. People just eat, digest, and leave. There isn't a lot of conversation. There isn't a lot of dialogue between families at the dinner table. Okay, so those are a few examples of a culture shock, but there are others, of course, that you can probably think of, even in the United States, maybe between regions or going from a big city to a small town. You might experience, just different ways of doing things. In even going to a college, right? Going to college, going to a new institution, maybe where things are done differently. You kind of feel a little disoriented at first. And over time, though, if you're lucky, you're able to sort of assimilate to that new culture. The term code switching, um, this is the kind of ability to flip fluidly between two or more languages or two or more dialects. This is done a lot, of course, by international students who come to the US, but also and immigrants as well may speak, one half of the sentence in Spanish and one half in English, or one half of the sentence in French and another half of it in English. Or, of course, it could also be done by regional dialect. And different ethnic groups and different racial groups might use terms that are more localized in their own group, but then will add mainstream English um, to the rest of their conversation. And we all kind of do code switching maybe a little bit from time to time, but especially it's used for people who are in ethnic groups that may be a racial minority or ethnic or religious minority or an international student, for example. Okay. Okay. So with culture, culture also comes with a set of scripts. Okay. Cultural scripts are modes of behavior that are non-universal or natural, but that may strongly shape beliefs and concepts held by society. Now, these cultural scripts are so ingrained by socialization, right? So we have all these different agents of socialization: parents, schools, friends, religion. And we're going to talk about the agents of socialization in the next chapter. So, the socialization process is the way by which we internalize our culture so that it becomes just ingrained, it becomes normal. And so the process of good socialization is that you just take all of these things for granted. It kind of becomes invisible. It does seem natural. So cultural scripts are these things that are really social. They're socially constructed, but through all the socialization process, they just become second nature. Okay, and cultural scripts can be anything from making eye contact with a person that you're talking to. That, of course, is part of American culture. But in other cultures, making eye contact is seen as a form of disrespect, especially if you're making eye contact with someone who is an elder, okay? Someone who is in a higher position than you are, for example. Another cultural script, of course, in the United States is shaking hands, asking, "How are you?" And and that is, we just take that for granted. And it's a norm in our society to just ask, "Oh, how are you?" And the norm is not to actually say literally, "How are you?" Right? It's not to say, "Oh, well, I didn't sleep well last night, and so I'm really groggy today. I have a sore throat, and I'm kind of lagging. I didn't make it to the gym because of that. I didn't make it to yoga." How are you is just another form of saying hi, right? You're not supposed to actually tell the person literally how you are. So, right, this is just another example of a cultural script. Um, we have these scripts in schools, right? That you sit down at desks, you raise your hand when you're asking a question. Same scripts in the workplace, scripts for any activity, right? That you walk into a store, you are expected to behave a certain way. You walk into a public place, you'll behave very differently than if you were in a private space. So these are these things we call norms that are just internalized through socialization. Um, and this, of course, relates to culture shock. Let's go back to the example of college. So if um, you're lucky, if you're, say, a low income student who is lucky enough, bright enough to get into like a Yale University or Harvard or Columbia, and we've done research, sociologists have done research on this. And what low-income students find when they attend these elite universities is they find that it's very disorienting for them. Okay, again, most students who attend these elite institutions come from very wealthy families or upper middle class families. They might be wearing Canada Goose jackets in the wintertime that cost $1,500. That might be almost, the unofficial dress code. They might be going to, every weekend they'll go out to the bars or pubs, spending a lot of money. They'll go vacationing in Mexico or Spain. And what low income students really tell social researchers when they go to elite institutions is they can keep up with the schoolwork, but it's very hard to keep up with the social life. And they can become very alienated um, and feel like an outsider in these institutions. Okay, let's talk about subcultures. So, a subculture is set apart from mainstream society in some way. And they either don't follow or they reject a key aspect of mainstream society, of that mainstream culture, that mainstream society of which they are separate from. So I'm sure you can think of some examples here of a subculture. One that quickly comes to mind for me is the Amish, right? So the Amish are a religious minority, but also a cultural minority. The Amish are, of course, concentrated in Pennsylvania, and then quite a large Amish community in Ohio and Indiana. But Pennsylvania is really the epicenter for the Amish in the US. And obviously, they reject a lot of forms of modern technology because they believe that this will weaken the social solidarity of the group. So they will reject a lot of modern conveniences. The family is a lot more extended instead of having nuclear families. Gender norms are very different from sort of modern mainstream gender norms. So there's a lot of different examples of, and you can think of subcultures and how some of the practices in subcultures might be, of course, practices that mainstream society have moved on from. Okay. Okay, I'm actually going to skip reflection theory. You can talk a little bit. I'm sorry, you can read a little bit about this in the book. I'm skipping this because it really isn't a major theory in sociology. The author talks about this quite well. So I'll just have you read Conley's summary of that. But let's move on to discussing media. Okay. And we talked a little bit about the media already when we discussed content analysis in the class on research methods and data analysis. So we can think of media as very inclusive and very broad. Media is anything that carries a message with it. So it can be a poster, a web page, a book, magazine, newspaper, social media site, television, movies, anything that music lyrics, music, just music in general, anything that carries with it a message. And then when we think of mass media, we tend to think of media that is available to a large population. Okay, maybe not a universal population, maybe not everyone in the society, but a very large number of people in the society. Um, the chapter talks about this concept of hegemony. And hegemony relates to the concept of power. Hegemony was coined and was coined by Antonio Gramsci and was a concept developed by Antonio Gramsci, who was very critical of the Nazis and the fascist regime in Italy. The Nazis, of course, in Germany. He grew up here. He came of age and worked in this time period, and he compared the different types of power. You can think of hegemony as kind of a soft power versus hard power. Hard power is power that is instilled by force. Hard power would be, for example, um, coercive power, either by a state, like a military, a police force, or by any type of coercive power. Um, Soft power is kind of influencing control, influencing the ideas of people through subtle means. Okay, um, hegemony is really exerting control over society by controlling the leading ideas in a society. Okay, it's exerting control over society by kind of controlling the leading ideas and influencing the ideology, influencing the main ideas in that society. So it's sort of a kind of a manufacturing of consent, what the larger population will accept and what they'll consent to. And it's a very powerful form of power because it's almost invisible. It almost becomes just, oh, this is just the way it is. This is just natural. This is the way of life. And hegemony has been used by our mass media and by our government, by our um, corporations, and by other institutions, other powerful institutions, perhaps the church, to sort of influence how people think about what is the right way to set up a society. Okay? Um, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the slide that is coming up here in just a couple of slides from here. So the media life cycle, we can think of this as looking at how the media influences people, how it might affect stereotypes, how it reflects the culture, and how it could also impact the culture. That's not just a reflection of it, but the media might also have agency. It can shape culture. It's not just shaped by culture, but it can also shape the culture itself. Um, Textual analysis, that's what we talked a little bit about in the methods chapter, when you can use these data analysis methods to analyze different types of texts. Um, I'll talk a little bit more about this here on the next slide as far as impacts of the media. So we can think of media effects as being long-term, I'm sorry, short-term and deliberate, long-term and deliberate, short-term and unintentional, and long-term and unintentional. So in this example, we can look at perhaps short-term and deliberate as well as long-term and deliberate. The advertising industry, of course, was created, and it was created in the 1920s, and I'll talk a little bit more about this on slides that are coming up. It was created to keep the economic machine going, right? So capitalism requires constant consumption, constant production, and constant consumption. You can think of our economic system as a shark that sort of has to keep eating. And if it doesn't keep eating, it sort of collapses, okay? And advertising was developed in the 1920s to create wants, okay? Advertising is about the creation of wants. And in the 1980s, our advertising industry and our television and our media laws were deregulated. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, began to deregulate media in the 1980s. And with this deregulation, you saw a massive increase in advertising, especially in advertising to children. And what we found, what sociologists have found, is that especially advertising to kids can have very detrimental impacts on families, especially the advertising of sugary sodas and sugary foods during, for example, cartoons that are aired on television. We've seen a massive, massive rise in obesity rates, type 2 diabetes, and other serious health problems as a result of all of the sugary and salty and poor fats that come with this highly processed diet that not only Americans in general are consuming, but kids are as well. And this is very much a product of massive, massive advertising. Now, it's not just candy and foods, but it's also the advertising of gadgets and toys and all of these things that then the kids beg their parents to purchase for them when they go out to stores like Best Buy or Target or Walmart. And so other countries have actually banned advertising geared for children. Sweden was the first country to ban advertising directed at children, and they've had positive impacts from that decision and better with better childhood health as a result of that. Just an aside, and it's not just the this advertising um, that's focused on children that is causing physical health problems. It's also changing kids' behavioral and psychological essences. Um, High levels of sugar, sodium, highly processed foods have been shown to actually increase memory problems, concentration problems, and aggression and ADHD. So, um, a poor diet can contribute not only to physical health problems, but also psychological and emotional health problems. Um, let's go back to so I would argue, I should say before we go, I would argue that the advertising towards children uh, would be short term and long term and deliberate, okay, rather than unintentional. It was the intention of those advertisers to sell as many products to kids, to the parents of the kids as they possibly could. Okay, so where do stereotypes come from? Um, Walter Lippmann actually coined this term stereotypes. Walter Lippmann was a famous journalist in the early 20th century who was also a social critic. And um, we'll talk about Lippmann more in a second on the next slide as well. Um, we see this a lot in the media, especially television, but we also see it in movies. Now, it's a business, right? So these are large conglomerates. Disney owns many other media companies. Um, Comcast owns many other companies, including NBC. CBS is owned by um, now I'm forgetting. It's owned by another Viacom, which is another very large multinational, multi-billion-dollar company. And these companies need to make profits for their shareholders, right? And so many stories are, and many types of stories are eliminated from ever seeing the light of day because they believe that those stories won't have a wide enough audience. So television and movies exist to sort of appeal to the broad mainstream. And because they want to appeal to the broadest audience possible, you tend to get a lot of characters and a lot of stories that are the stories are all kind of similar. And if you look at all the superhero movies, you know, like Thor and all the other movies, they all are very similar plot. And just to the fact that we all have nowadays are superhero movies speaks to the fact that Hollywood knows that this is a winning formula and they'll keep making a lot of money off this from audiences. And the same goes with stereotypes. Stereotypes tend to not be completely untrue, but they contain a lot of half truths, or they're mostly half truths, or not the whole story. But why the media uses stereotypes a lot is again because they want to appeal to audiences. And audiences already have in their mind like these kind of understood images of how certain people and certain groups are, and even if this image is not accurate. And so So let me give you one example. Television and film will often stereotype the working class as lazy and unintelligent. Um, and in doing so, because they stereotype the working class as lazy and unintelligent, then we can kind of think that, well, they deserve the menial, low paid, low wage jobs that they have. And this is shown to have actually quite a strong influence on how people view the economy and how they view fairness, for example, in the job market and in the economy. So, but we all kind of have that picture, right? Of like maybe the blue collar or the working class that might have some truth in it, but it's only a half truth or a partial truth. It's definitely not the whole story. Or, the media will also play up stereotypes regarding religion or race or different ethnicities, or even stereotypes, masculine stereotypes or feminine stereotypes. And again, they do that because they want to reach a wide enough audience that has already sort of understood these scripts, understood these stereotypical scripts that are widely present in society. Okay, so that would be an example of how the media uses stereotypes to, sell their products. Okay, we're almost done here. We just have a few more slides. As I said, media ownership in the US is very concentrated. It's in the hands of a very few number of companies. Disney, Comcast control more than 50, themselves control more than 50% of the um, media landscape as far as television and um, film. And it's very interesting to take a critical examination of the media and the kind of stories that they air versus the stories that they don't air. What makes the news and what doesn't make the news? What is considered news and what is not considered news? So these are all questions that people who analyze the news and analyze the media ask. Let's just talk about one example. So the media focused very heavily. I'm sure you've seen all of these protests at the state capitals of people who are protesting the stay at home orders that the governors in those states issued. And these were widespread in the media. The media covered these protests every day during the duration of the crisis. Um, the media has not really, especially the corporate media like NBC, Fox, CNN, PBS maybe has covered these other protests a little bit more. But overall, the large networks and the large cable media providers have not covered the worker strikes at Amazon warehouses. They've not covered the worker protests at the meat packing plants. And the reason they don't cover that is because those worker protests and worker strikes are a threat to these corporations. They're a threat to kind of the corporate narrative. These media companies like NBC, CNN, they are large corporations that seek to make profits for their shareholders and subsidiaries. And they really won't air stories that kind of threaten big business in any way. You saw this a lot with many years ago with sort of a media blackout of the Occupy Wall Street movements. You also saw a media blackout of the anti-fracking protesters. Those were very much those were not at all covered. Very rarely were they covered in the media. In contrast to that, the media is covering these stay-at-home protesters, these anti-stay-at-home law protesters, rather, that come to the state capitals, because those protesters who are wanting the economies to reopen, that kind of benefits the business class that owns the media. Okay, so it's connected in that way. It's also why you won't see anti-war protests. So during the run up to the Iraq War, you really did not see too many anti-war protests that were being covered in the media, even though you actually had thousands of anti-war protests, the biggest of which was 1 million people in New York City and 1 million people in London. And it was given a virtual blackout um, in the media running up to that war, which began in 2003. And it's largely a result of this media ownership. So NBC, for example, had been owned at the time by General Electric, and General Electric is a very large military contractor. They produce weapons, they produce engines for fighter planes, they produce nuclear submarines. And so there were journalists, there were reporters at NBC that wanted to cover these anti-war protesters, but the corporate offices would not allow those stories to air, okay, because it was a threat to their business model. Okay, so um, we talked a little bit about how advertising is really about the creation of wants, okay? This also comes back to the idea of hegemony, right? Um, Soft power, controlling the leading ideas in the society that we're in. And so the media, especially advertisements, play a large role in the maintenance of our economic structure, our economic system, and consumerism. So in the 1920s, this was the beginning of advertising. And advertising grew out of propaganda during World War I, which began in 1914. So during World War I, most Americans were very much opposed to the war. They did not want to get involved with an overseas war in Europe. They thought that Europe should deal with its own problems. We shouldn't get entangled um, with that continent, with issues in that continent, that they shouldn't suck us into that. And so Woodrow Wilson, who wanted to go to war, who wanted to become a part of World War I, began to employ propaganda techniques to make Americans become against the Germans. Uh, they ran a radio, and at this time it was radio. They began massive radio campaigns to sort of demonize the Germans as a way to rile up American support for overseas intervention in Europe. And the propagandist techniques and the exact same people who created these radio stories, radio advertisements to boost support for the war, they, after the war, began the first advertising companies on Madison Avenue in New York City. And they took those propaganda techniques, those emotionally manipulative techniques, to then the selling of consumer products. At the same time, in the 1920s, this was the growth of industrialization and urbanization in the United States. This was the time when factories started churning out a lot of mass-produced goods like radios, like kitchen appliances, and what the um, what the companies found was that as long as the Americans had a roof over their heads, enough to eat, and a little bit of savings in the bank, they were pretty happy. And they found that once Americans had sort of this basic economic security, they were pretty happy. And but that doesn't really work when you're trying to live in an industrial capitalist economy where it's this continual consumption of goods that keeps the economy going. So they found that their new industrial economy was not going to last unless they got people to consume much more than they were consuming. And so this is when you see the bombardment, the beginning of the bombardment of advertising to create wants. Um, Advertising also had a more insidious goal. In the 1920s, with the growth of cities, industries, and immigration that was coming from Eastern Europe, it was causing unrest in the society. There were huge, huge worker strikes, labor protests. A lot was happening politically in the country. You had new radical groups that were mainly made up of workers and radical farmers that were trying to gain some foothold politically in our society. So, yeah, again, you saw a lot of strikes, a lot of protests, and so the government coordinated with corporate America and the advertising industry to sort of redirect people's attention away from work and labor to consumption. Okay. And this was their words, not mine. You had the large advertising executives in New York who literally said, we need to direct Americans to the superficial aspects of life so that they stop thinking about that they're getting exploited at their workplace. We need to redirect their energy, redirect their focus to purchasing items from stores. We need to redirect their energy to consumerism so that they will think of themselves as consumers, not as citizens. And through over the decades, this process worked, right? And it's why teenage girls on Saturdays go to the shopping mall instead of go to the library, right? Because this hegemonic um, cultural force has been so imparted into us as a society. Okay, I'll let you just look at Pew's interview on your own time.